The medical model is looking at plant medicines from that perspective of bringing the medicines into a laboratory, of taking the medicines out of their sacred context and creating dosages and creating protocols. So when we look at the medical model, we are not necessarily honoring these indigenous ways of knowing. When we look at sacred plant medicines, we're looking at a tradition that is thousands of years old, traditions, right, that are thousands of years old, that come from indigenous cultures, right? And so in these contexts, the medicines are communed with, the medicines are worked with in a ceremonial way, and healing happens in community. Right? And healing also happens when these ceremonial spaces are held by lineage holders and indigenous people that hold generations upon generations of wisdom and knowledge in how to commune with these medicines and how to work with these medicines in the deepest way possible, right? I think it's wonderful that the medical model is starting to understand the value of how sacred medicines, sacred earth medicines, sacred plant medicines are important in our healing and are important in addressing our trauma. We, as a culture, are carrying, as we know, a lot of intergenerational, a lot of historical trauma, right? As well as the individual trauma that gets incurred by being in systems that are so heavily traumatized, right? So I don't want to be redundant in trying to explain how important plant medicines are in healing this trauma that we're carrying at so many levels. So with that said, the medical model is looking at plant medicines from that perspective of bringing the medicines into a laboratory, of taking the medicines out of their sacred context and creating dosages and creating protocols and creating spaces that are removing the individual from community and bringing them into an office space, a therapeutic space, and working with that individual in that way, right? Which is not necessarily wrong, right? It can be helpful, as we have seen in all the studies that have been conducted now with certain medicines, right? So when we look at the medical model, we are not necessarily honoring these indigenous ways of knowing, and we're excluding these indigenous ways of knowing and these indigenous ways of working with the medicines.